Exciting. Now, okay. Well, first of all, thank you so much for the invitation, Johan and Kazakhs, for hosting this event. I'm going to talk about why companies should embrace behavioral economics and experiments in their daily work. But before I start, let me get you a little bit of a background, who I am. So I have a PhD in behavioral and experimental economics from the University of Aarhus, and now I'm a researcher at the University of Gothenburg. So what is a researcher? It's a person who got a PhD and is not yet a professor, hopefully soon, but kind of in between. And then I had a lot of research days at the University of Chicago, the University of California, San Diego, and then O'Reilly Center for Advanced Hindsight. So when Johan said that this is as close as we get to the Nobel Prize, well, it was a bit literally because my office was actually next door to Thaler's office. He does this thing that in the wintertime he's actually in San Diego, and in summertime he's in Chicago. So you can kind of switch, and we switched on the same day, 1st of May, over from San Diego to Chicago. In my research, I work on behavioral economics and also nudging, applying that in practice with municipalities such as Karlstad or Gothenburg, different companies, charities, nonprofit organizations. And after behavioral economics and nudging has become so popular in practice, I've started also giving talks as a public speaker, and by now I've trained over 250 practitioners in different courses on nudging and behavioral economics. And now very recently, together with Nurit, who's there in the audience, we started a company, Impactually, to actually help people and help companies embrace behavioral insights and also experimental design in their daily work. And as another fun fact, if you ever want to take Richard Taylor out for food, he really likes Korean barbecue. So we went to this very nice place close to Lincoln Park in Chicago and had some Korean barbecue tacos and talked about his research with Uber and his experiences. So yeah, so if you ever get the chance, take him out for Korean barbecue tacos. Okay, so with my background, you might assume that I would be really good at making decisions. I mean, I have a PhD in behavioral economics, so I should really know how to get myself to do the things that I want to do. Because if I can't do it, then who should be able to do it? But I have a very interesting example, I think, where this really doesn't work. So when I was small, my grandmother gave me such a mutual fund, and that was great. So all the time when I was growing up, she always put some money in that, and I still have this fund. But what I learned later, it's better you should invest into exchange-traded funds. They have much lower fees, and they have lost volatility, and I don't spend a lot of money paying for managers that manage my funds. But I've been doing this for a long time, already have exchange-traded fund trading account set up, but this money from my grandmother is still in that other account. So all I would need to do is send one email to sell that fund and push it over into my other account. I still haven't done it. So year by year, I'm losing a lot of money paying for these costs, and I just can't get myself to sit down and do it. So maybe I'm not the best example to be speaking about this. So why is it so difficult to get from good intentions to actions? When we look at behavioral economics, we really see it as this missing piece. So when we want to use behavioral economics in practice, it's most interesting in situations where you already have the correct information. Like me with my ETFs. I know that that's a better way to invest than to invest into mutual funds. You have access to the necessary technology. I already have my trading account set up. It's not that difficult. I know how to send emails, so it is something that I could be doing. And I have the right intentions. I know that this is what I should be doing. I've been planning this for a while, and yet you don't observe the expected outcome. There's still something missing that's keeping you from doing that. So maybe I'm like this guy here. Every time I intend to do this, something else comes up that's more fun, that seems more pressing, or I just forget that that's what I wanted to do. So what prevents us from making all these really good rational decisions when we know what we should be doing and we know that we have the right technology? Well, I'm pretty sure that most of you sitting here have already heard a little bit, so I'm not going to go into too many details. I'm just going to point out, for example, overconfidence, because that's something where Daniel Kahneman, who got the Nobel Prize in psychology and economics in 2002, said if you could eliminate one bias, this one would be it, because this is the most dangerous one. Who here knows what the Dunning-Kruger effect is? Hands up. Okay, a couple of people. This one's related to overconfidence. So if you ever ask yourself, why are there people who call themselves experts, although they obviously don't really know what they're doing, then this is what's happening. We could think about a certain head of state. Maybe we might want to rename this effect by his name. And that means the ones who don't know what they don't know can't make the right decisions. So only when I really know what I don't know do I know that I'm missing information. Alright, so that's a very important part here. So you might truly believe, actually, that you know everything. But if you don't know everything, then it's hard to tell how much you don't know. So I tried giving this presentation in Swedish once, having Swedish slides, and then I don't know all the grammar mistakes I'm making because I don't know which ones I could be making. So the obvious ones, of course, I can catch, but all the smaller wrong words I used, I can't see it because I'm not that good at Swedish to actually catch this. So that's a bit the idea. So I hope you learned one new bias today. And it's going to be relevant in a couple of the examples I talk about. So why is behavioral economics then so interesting? Because it can help us understand behavior by understanding these different biases, running experiments to figure out what is systematically affecting people's behavior. And this can help us then predict behavior for the future so we can help people make better decisions and try to redesign the decision-making environment. For today, I picked two topics that I wanted to talk about that I think are relevant for a lot of companies. And one of these is hiring and diversity, which we're going to start with. So have a look at this picture here. What colors do you see? Orange. This one is pink. Yes. Green. Blue. Right? Okay. So we see orange, pink, blue, and green on the screen. White. We also see white. Yes. Very important. We see black also. That's good. Petrol down here. Okay. Good. Not for the colorblind. But if I now just move them next to each other, and now we see that what we saw before as blue and as green is actually the exactly same color. So if we go back to it, so I just showed you that this is the exact same color, and now you again look at it, but if you're like me, then you still see this one is green and this one is blue, although I just told you that it's the exact same color, and if I go back, it's the same color, I promise. Right? So why am I showing you this? Why is this important? This has been important because even sometimes when we're fully aware of our biases, when people tell us this is your bias, this is how you're seeing things, we're still going to make the wrong choices in particular situations. So even though we can try to learn, and when people talk about the ethics of nudging, we need to inform people and we need to tell them these biases they have to help them, I was just telling you what the bias is, and you're going to still see this as two different colors. So sometimes we'll need to think about how can we change the decision environment to help people make better decisions, because it's going to be very hard to overcome these biases. One example that maybe some of you have heard of before is that the case of orchestra players. So here it was in the 70s, they made an important change to change the gender distribution for orchestra players. Before that, people went on stage, they were playing the violin, they would play, and then people would decide whether they wanted to hire them for the orchestra or not. But interestingly, apparently women were quite terrible at playing different instruments because the share of women in orchestras was about 5%. So that might be because women are not that good at playing instruments, but what they then did is that they introduced a curtain. So now people were playing behind the curtain, so the hiring committees could not see whether it was a male or a female or what they looked like. And after the introduction, the share went up to almost 40% of women in orchestras. And these people had the best reasons to, they really wanted to hire the best musicians, right? They didn't want to have a male orchestra, they wanted to have the best, these were the best orchestras in the world, and they wanted to hire the best people. But they could not overcome their bias that women don't look like orchestra players, at least in the 70s. So then only after they added this curtain did it help them really overcome this bias. Similarly, well, we now maybe look at a different type of diversity. So now we look at, this is Arabic names and Swedish names. So here they did different studies in different countries. Either, for the Swedish one, they had Eric, Karl, and Lars, which are the most common names in Sweden, and Ali, Reza, and Mohammed, which are the most common Arabic names in Sweden. And then send out the exact same CV, the exact same application, and all they did is randomly assign different names. So either a Swedish name or an Arabic name. And what they find is that if they send out applications with Arabic names, these people have to send 50% more applications in order to get the same amount of callbacks to come in for interviews. In the UK, this is even a bit of a higher figure, at least in this particular experiment, but Sweden, also the US and Australia, this is about 50% more. Similarly, we showed in studies that the applications that come first, just the one that's on top of the stack, is going to get better points than the next person that comes along. If you're randomly the first person that gets chosen, you will get better points than the next person that comes along because there's nobody yet to compare you to. Very interesting, I think today I was reading on LinkedIn and somebody had stated and said, don't you love this process in the hiring process when you're sitting there in the interview and you really connect with the candidate and you get this good gut feeling and you realize that's the person I want to hire. That's part of my favorite part of the hiring process. And then you get 4,000 likes. And there were so many people who were writing, yes, I like that feeling when I feel that person and I really connect on a deeper level. Somebody even connected it to love at first sight. It's like I meet somebody and then, so I wrote Bunder's like, it's amazing for love at first sight. It's great if you find somebody who thinks like you and who's exactly like you and who likes the same cookies as you. But maybe if you want to have a good company, you should find somebody that's actually good at the job and not necessarily into the same type of cookies. So that might be something to consider here. Another study showed that if you have stereotypical male language, men are much more likely to apply, where it's like fearless, assertive, looking for champions, determined. These type of adjectives speak more often to men on average, but it can also be turned around if, say, nurturing, warm, collaborative. This is something that speaks to women a lot. And then you get a very bias already in the hiring process, so you don't even get that many people who apply for those positions. One study, this is one of my own research studies. Here we wanted to look at how people react to feedback. Again, it's a gender study. And there was some idea that women would internalize feedback much more, and if they fail, so if I go up for a promotion, I lose, I'm more likely to think I wasn't good enough. I can't. So now if I'm applying for professor positions and they take me, I'll say I'm just not good enough, I'm not smart enough. Well, men are more likely to say, well, it was unfair, or I was unlucky, there was some other person going up to me. It's like, that has nothing to do with me, it was just a situation. So we did this with 700 students in a very controlled way, and we found that if we just give them this feedback, you lost, you must have been unlucky, or you lost, you must not have tried hard enough, so kind of an effort component, there's no difference between how men and women react. But when we say, you lost, you're maybe not that good at math, so it was math tasks they were doing, we see all the women dropping out of the competition and the men going in and competing even more. Kind of like, I'll show you that I can do this. And which was bad for the men because they didn't get a lot of money from the experiment because they lost the second time around. So maybe they'll learn eventually, but at least in our experiment, yeah, they then had lower earnings than the women because they all dropped out and they would earn more from competitions. So there's a little bit of an idea where behavioral economics can be relevant in the hiring process and where our biases can affect our decisions in a negative way. So now I have two more studies that look at optimization, so different types of systems in the companies. One study that I did was Folkekirkens Nødhjælp. This is one of the biggest charities in Denmark. We wanted to see whether sending reminders is a good idea to get more people to donate. So there's lots of studies showing that if you don't solicit donations directly, so if you don't ask people directly, they're not going to give. So yes, we see this if we send one email, or if we send to another group, we send 2 emails, well, we see a modest increase in donations. So that works. But what we weren't anticipating is that so many people are unsubscribing from the mailing list. And these people are then lost to the charity forever because they unsubscribe and we can't solicit them anymore. So the more you push and the more you send these reminders, yes, you get a positive effect, but potentially you also get a very large negative effect. And this is something that the charity hadn't considered before. They were just only looking at the data at how much money came in, but they weren't looking at how many people they were losing from the mailing list, at least not in such a controlled way. So that was quite an interesting insight to think about how often can we actually send emails, how often can Johan send this group emails before people say, no, I don't want emails every second day, I'm going to unsubscribe. Right? But then maybe you're missing that great event with Richard Taylor next year in the fall because you unsubscribe because you get an email every week from him. Another study, this was done by a friend of mine, by Virgin Atlantic. So here they wanted to see, well, we can't really get people to fly less, so we can't really reduce CO2 emissions by getting people to fly less, at least not through behavioral insights. Maybe we need taxes or regulations. But maybe we can make the flying more efficient. So here they gave the pilots different types of feedback based on how they were flying and how they could be flying more fuel efficiently, such as turning off one of the engines when taxiing. And these were super experienced pilots. These have been flying for 20 years, so they all knew this information. This was not new to them. But it helped that they got these reminder emails, these targets, every month for a period of 8 months to reduce fuel by about 20%, 21,000 metric tons less carbon emissions, about $5 million in savings because of this more fuel-efficient flying, and sending out the newsletters or these reminders was about $1,000 for the whole experiment. So my friend who first wrote to every single company on LinkedIn that had that there was an airline company, said, oh, we want to do this experiment, do you want to do it? Nobody responded until Virgin Atlantic. Now they had to open their consultancy because every single airline company now wants to do these type of experiments. Because paying $1,000, even if you add consultancy fees, saving $5 million, that's a pretty good ratio, I think. And of course, also the carbon emissions. So let's say a little bit before I finish about the scientific method. So what would we really need to do in order to implement behavioral insights? So first of all, we need to think about very precisely who is the target group, who do we want to work with. Because when we work with behavior, other than maybe working with general information campaigns, it's not about in general changing attitudes or changing a large group of people. It's going to be very targeted because we have to think about what are these particular biases, where is that gap that I'm not reaching. So we'll think about what the desired outcome is and then what behavior gets us there. Again, right, it's not about opinions or beliefs, it's really about why am I not making that step? Why am I not turning off that second engine when taxiing, for example? Then the next step, we'll map out the behavior from start to finish. So we'll really think about what are all the steps that go into the process, and then we'll try to find out what are the cognitive barriers restricting us. So when we do this in research, this is also where we'll often do these type of experiments that I just talked about with the different feedback. So we'll try to understand how do people react to particular situations versus others. Then we'll think about an intervention. Definitely one that is going to have the biggest impact. There might be some that might change behavior a little bit, but of course we want to have the ones that are really going to have the biggest impact. For example, in the pilot study, they had 3 different variations, and only one of them really drove most of the results. And that you only get by testing. And that's going to be the last step, running an experiment, running a controlled study. All the evidence I've been showing you until now really comes from testing. So we know it's a 5% increase, it's a 10% increase, maybe it's a 20% decrease in something that we're not anticipating. And that's really going to help us figure out, is this just a trend over time? Is more people coming to this event now or before? Is that just because now this topic is more interesting? Or did you really do something different this time than last time, which changed behavior? very basically, what is a randomized controlled trial? So how do these experiments work? We have a general group of people. This might be employees in a company. This might be pilots. This might be employers that are receiving CVs. We split them into 2 equal groups. So on average, both of these groups should be the same, should have the same characteristics, the same beliefs, the same preferences. And then we administer an intervention for one group and not for the other group. And then we can look at the differences and figure out, did our intervention matter to these people or didn't it? So this is, of course, keeping it very simple, but that's how most of this research is done. And it's actually not that difficult to do, even in a practical sense. So I also know of some companies, I mean, if you think about this lean startup method or A/B testing, I mean, marketing, this has already been done quite a lot. But we can also transfer it to things like hiring processes or other type of optimization, and not just in the marketing sphere. For example, this is a quote from Duolingo. They say, "We test nearly everything and focus on whatever produces results. Instead of leaving decisions to opinion or egos or background, we let the metrics do the vast majority of the decisions." And now if we come back to the overconfidence, what I talked about in the beginning, once we start applying these behavioral insights, we need to be aware that we are also biased, that we are also overconfident, that if we spend a lot of money in a particular intervention, we want to see it working. So when you have a huge advertising campaign, you want to believe that this had a huge effect on sales. So if you don't really do it in a clean statistical way, there is a huge risk that you're going to see in the data what you want to see. You have a diversity training, and then you want to see that this actually increased diversity in the firm without actually testing it. So we'll have to think about it. Yes, we might want to steer other people's behaviors, but we are also biased. So let's keep that in mind, and let's help us. So how will we get started? Just very general tips. So if you seriously want to get started, then this is using behavioral economics to close this intention-action gap. I mean, there's little things you could do. We've probably all seen this, have smaller plate sizes or put the broccoli a bit closer to people. So these smaller nudges that we talk about. But there's so much more that we can do with behavioral economics that is not just these tiny nudges in a decision environment. But then we would have to think about finding a situation in your company where the technology is already available, the knowledge is there, the need is clear, but the action is lacking. And that's really where this is going to have the most effect. If the technology isn't working, or if people don't even know what they're supposed to do, it will be hard to try to use behavioral insights in this case. So this is really kind of a last mile step, or the last step you can do to get that behavior. Find yourself a behavioral economist, behavioral scientist who has experience with running and designing these randomized controlled trials, so you really get some evidence for what you've been doing. Has a high level of econometrics and statistics if he wants to be really awesome, some cool knowledge about handling bigger data. I know some people are in the audience who can do that. And has a degree in research experiments in economics or social psychology, so you really know what they're doing. And then be open to trying a new data-based way of working. And if this wasn't enough for you today and you need something for your Christmas wish list or something to do over the holidays, so these are lots of the books we recommend. I haven't read all of them, I have to admit. Yes. So I would say it's 2 questions. So personally, I think, so nudging is a particular way of influencing behavior, which is not economic incentives. So those are 2 different things. But using behavioral economics, so most behavioral economists would actually say nudging is just a very small part of behavioral economics. So, for example, having incentives instead of having one large incentive at the end, having incentives at multiple times, or having increasing incentives or decreasing incentives, so lots of different ways is, for example, the book I had here, the y-axis. It's a whole book about just how to use incentives in a behavioral economic way. For example, discrimination that can be maybe overcome with incentives if people try harder. So it's a good question. So nudging is not using economic incentives. So there we have a difference. But behavioral economics, behavioral insights in general, nudging is one tool, and incentives, personally, I would say is a stronger tool and the one that's been used more. It's just that now I think with the Nobel Prize, and also because often if we talk about it in a policy perspective, having taxes and subsidies is harder to implement than trying to use nudging. So maybe on lower levels, municipalities might use nudging because, yeah, it's just cheaper. But I think in many cases, incentives will be the stronger incentive to change behavior, definitely. So it's definitely allowed. I don't think it's in any way manipulating. It's probably more obvious. But yeah, it's just two ways, and I think if you work with this, you should use both ways in the correct situation. Thank you.